form. It clearly is a troublesome business to blur the line between fact and fiction, between journalism and drama, and to enlist dramatic techniques to make journalistic points. That's clearly a risky business, and clearly calls for a good deal of care in those who practice it.
But the justification remains that more of us will be more inclined to watch and better able to understand something that doesn't just recall events, but shows us people and places as best it can.
The most striking example, I suppose, inside my personal experience was a thing we made about an incident during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where we got hold of a document describing in great detail how the Red Guards had put one of Mao's rivals on trial. Well, more elusive and difficult material, it would be impossible to imagine. And when we first read that material, it was like reading a document dropped from Mars, but with an all-Chinese cast and underpinning and labeling and so forth. It was possible to present in a dramatized form what was hopefully a revealing account of something which had not previously been brought to an English television audience.
I spent 4 years in university, 2 years postgraduate course. I studied physics in Furen University. It was a Catholic university, but it had nothing to do with God. I didn't have much of a social life at the time, and I devoted myself to books. But I was rather arrogant.
Wang Guangmei, let me ask you, how did you manage to worm your way into the revolutionary camp?
As somebody who made and has made and continues to make conventional documentaries, I'm all too aware that what's presented as being a fly on the wall is inevitably subject to a great degree of directorial intervention, that nobody walks through a door without being asked to do so, that editing techniques inevitably adjust what you're looking at. At least drama documentary has the possibility of owning up to what it's doing, rather than presenting it as the unvarnished fact.
The sort of effort Leslie Woodhead believes necessary to match dramatic reconstruction with the known fact is seen in the latest Granada production, which he directed, Invasion.
The starting point for Invasion was a tiny cutting in the Guardian newspaper saying that a highly placed member of Mr. Dubček's government had come to live in the West and that he had at his disposal an extremely detailed account of what had happened in Prague and in Moscow at the time of the Soviet invasion. We then went away and boiled all of that down, and David Bolton, another colleague, wrote a dramatic script based on that information. That script then went back to our informant, who, being an extremely arrogant and forceful man, said, you don't understand that this man would never say this to this man. This man wasn't close enough to Dubček to call him Sasha. He had a more hands-off relationship with him. We then took it back, talked about that, tried to accommodate those things, sent it back to him when he sent back an only less detailed list of objections. And that went on over a period of months, stretching into years. We put more effort into Invasion than anything we'd done before. Partly because it was possible to get into Prague and to do a good deal of research on the ground into the settings that we were reconstructing. The designer and I made a trip to Prague. We were able to get into the Presidium building in Prague, where most of our key scenes took place.
Comrades, it is a great pleasure to me, a great pleasure, that the friendly discussions between our fraternal parties have shown we can adopt a common approach to the problems and difficulties we have been discussing.
Woodhead was very aware that behind those look-alike actors, he was dealing with people still alive, still vulnerable. And while he was working on Invasion, he was faced with a rare test. General Grigorenko turned up in New York, allowed to visit his son by the Soviet authorities who then banned his return. And he asked to see that British film the KGB had told him about in prison.
And his associates are unwise and nationally harmful.
We'd felt at the time that we perhaps had overstated it, particularly the place where he suffered his worst humiliations. There was a cell with straw mattresses and so forth that we tried to make as accurate as possible according to the best information. He said it was even nastier than we'd made it, which was intriguing. One would imagine that the tendency is to glamorize. In fact, we'd finished up understating.
That sort of acid test comes all too rarely. Woodhead passed. But for most of us, as viewers, facing a constant stream of dramatisations of very different sorts, it's very difficult to judge the value of everything we see. Even Woodhead admits that the labelling in the end must yield to the drama. When things are presented as plays, it's even trickier. Take this one. Peter McHenry as Albie Sachs, the South African lawyer thrown in solitary confinement for working against apartheid.
This was served on me last night.
What is it?
It's the result of your application.
I haven't made an application.
You are supposed to read it. It's your books and writing paper.
What?
You've got to read it.
Yes, of course. In the Supreme Court of South Africa, Cape of Good Hope Division, having read the documents filed on record, the court declares the applicant entitled to be supplied with or to be permitted to receive and use a reasonable supply of reading matter and writing material. Oh, boy!
Well, now you have read it. Sign here.
Of course.
Doesn't help, you know. Your people keeping on at me, making a fuss. The telephone's not stopped. I said I would consider it when I had studied what the judgment said.
You are. I mean, you will. 'Tis the order of the court.
I mean, if they'd listened to me, none of this would have been needed, but policemen are so obstinate. I mean, I would have given you a book or two and there would have been no case.
You did. Your encyclopedia, and I'm very grateful.
Now they come serving orders on me.
Now, I saw that, was interested in the story, but I found the jailer a bit too strong. A powerhouse performance by Stratford-Johns, but somehow too theatrical for something I'm being asked to believe was how it was. Minutes later, again on Newsnight, the real Albie Sachs. And he says...
I was particularly impressed with the presentation of Captain Snowman.
Did he really look like that?
No, he didn't look like that. He didn't. Snowman was a thin person, a lean person, angular, bony. But what came through with Stratford-John's performance was the quality of the man and his relationship with me. I'm sure when I wrote the story, that came through in a more rich way than many of the other interrogators.
See? They can make us too sceptical. If we take these things at all seriously, and they're surely pointless if we can't, we're being asked to put our faith in the programme maker. So the more he goes into interpretation and conjecture, the greater his responsibilities. Which brings us to the biggest row of the lot. On the 6th of March 1980, the nation woke to find itself facing the wrath of one of the most influential states on earth, Saudi Arabia. We saw our ambassador sent home, trade deals threatened, the cause, of course, death of a princess. It was all smoothed over, but at home doubts remained, not least among other television filmmakers, about Anthony Thomas's rumour-packed and dramatic film. The row, put bluntly, was about honesty. Anthony Thomas wasn't saying, this is how it was. He was saying, this is how people told me it was. He even cast an actor as himself, hearing the conflicting rumours. That, I have to say, is a way a lot of reporting of closed societies is done, whether it be Saudi Arabia or Westminster. But was this way of doing it warning enough for television?
Sorry, can we go back to the beginning? There he is. He's not wearing any kind of uniform.
No, just dressed like any old Arab you see in the street. He didn't have a great big massive shining sword neither. About that long it was. None too sharp.
For me, that was enough. I felt I did know what Thomas was about, though of course you then judge the value of the information for yourself. But it seems it was the dramatisation that tipped the balance, not just to be told, as in a newspaper, of a princess who danced all night, of illicit meetings, of a public execution, but to see it played out.
They led him into the middle of the square. The guy's hands were tied behind his back. He looked as though he'd been drugged or beaten up or something. He was wobbling about all over the place. He wasn't resisting. They led the girl off to the right-hand side as I were looking at it. She were veiled. I didn't see her face. Any road, they knelt her down by this pile of sand. It's daft, but you see, I'd still no idea what were going to happen to her. I mean, I knew she wanted to pass a buyer out like that, but as far as I was concerned, there was just one guy we're going to get done. I kept trying to get a better view, and there were these big iron wheels at my back, and there were all these Arabs, lad, perched on the wheels and on the wall behind, just like vultures. Anyway, I ran round the back of the crowd, and I made towards them. We're about halfway there, and the shooting started. The girl were already dead. She was just a black heap. They'd knelt her down, like, in front of the sand and shot her.
Death of a princess is somehow a case on its own. It's hard to think of something now that could offend a state with quite such repercussions. And if the Saudi royal family hadn't been stirred to react, would anyone else next morning have noticed? Perhaps our anxiety should be nearer home. Princesses or governments, dead or alive, will have their defenders, statesmen, their descendants. But what about ordinary people? Do you remember Jimmy Boyle, the Glasgow hard man who went through a brutal career, a brutal imprisonment, and then into a special unit in Barlinnie jail where he revealed all sorts of talents. Amid much apprehension, especially in Scotland, a dramatisation of Boyle's story was brought vividly to ITV's screen in February. There was no doubt about the toughness. I felt there was no call to be on Boyle's side either. There was, of course, criticism. Some said that because we saw only Boyle's mob against the warders, it implied all prison life was like that. Some said seeing him swanning around Glasgow made him seem a hero. I didn't see it that way at all. To me, he was shown as a thug who led thugs and invited thuggishness. But remember Law and Order, the series that ended with the BBC's cameras being barred from British prisons.
You seem determined not to learn anything from experience. Well, understand this. I am equally determined to break you.
What? Like you to Bobby Mark?
Quiet! The 56 days cellular confinement that you've been sentenced to will be different from any previous sentence. First, you will have absolutely no contact, other than with warders. No privileges whatsoever. You will be in a stripped cell. If any breach of discipline is reported to me, however minor, your 56 days sentence will begin again.
After the row that followed that, the BBC brought an American professor in to test how people reacted to such a tale of legal corruption and prison brutality. And the viewers, it seemed, heard the tales with interest, but didn't much change their generally friendly view of the law. So what bothered me about A Sense of Freedom was not so much the view of prison life, but this, as Boyle reaches the special unit's more liberal regime.
Up there, second one along. Try to get settled, then I'll see you later.
Which is where the film stopped and the story surely started. That was in 1974. In 1981, Jimmy Boyle's on his way to parole, which is why anyone would want to film his story. To stop there is surely unfair. And that reminded me of another drama, for Sense of Freedom, Law and Order were offered as dramas, as films. Dummy, the story of a profoundly deaf and therefore dumb girl who grew up striving to lead a normal life. whose marriage broke, who got caught up in prostitution, drugs, murder. A real girl, played by Geraldine James in a brilliant film. Frank Rodham, its young director, went on to make the movie Quadrophenia. I thought it a tough but moving insight into a desperately hard life.
What are you going to do with that,
A real girl. But today, thinking about Dummy again, I realise that I know a bit more about life from this faction of her story and about myself. But I haven't asked, and no one's told me, and it seems not to matter what happened to her. We'll be back with another view of television, this time from the receiving end, on The Box, next week.
Peter Fiddick returns with another television programme next Thursday at 12:30.